In my hometown, it's common for infants who can't yet walk to sleep in a cradle. You know, those traditional cradles made with long ropes and cloth, often hung from a doorway. It's been a custom for generations, and maybe you've experienced it yourself as a baby, rocked gently to sleep by your parents. My nephew, Liam, was no exception. Whenever his mom was busy cleaning or cooking, he would sleep in the cradle. Sometimes I would be the one watching over him, swinging the cradle gently to lull him to sleep. But one night, something happened that I will never forget. That morning, Liam had been taken for his immunizations. By evening, he developed a high fever, which sent the entire family into a panic. My brother Ethan called me to ask if I could stay at their house to keep watch while he and his wife, Claire, drove Liam to the doctor. In our small town, the nearest pediatrician was in the city, hours away. Though the midwife had already prescribed medication, Claire was insistent on seeing a specialist. My mother and I agreed to stay at Ethan's house. The night didn't feel particularly quiet. Neighbors were still gathered outside, chatting on the porch. Around 11 p.m., Ethan called to say they were still at the clinic, but would be heading back soon. My mother and I decided to rest in the small guest room, directly across from Liam's nursery. The cradle, which usually hung in the nursery doorway, was folded up and tied neatly to the doorframe since it wasn't in use. At around 11:30 p.m., I was startled awake by a faint sound coming from Liam's room. Curious, I peeked through the curtain hanging over the guest room door. My heart skipped a beat. There, in the dim light of the hallway, I saw the cradle swinging gently. Liam was inside it, being rocked by unseen hands. For a moment, I thought Ethan and Claire had returned early. I could hear faint murmurs, almost like Claire's soothing voice. Relieved, I lay back down, assuming all was well. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard the unmistakable sound of Ethan's motorcycle pulling into the driveway. They were only just getting home. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I sat up and shook my mother awake. "Mom, I just saw Liam in the cradle, but Ethan and Claire are only arriving now. Who was rocking him?" She brushed it off, saying I must have been dreaming. Still uneasy, I went to the front door to greet Ethan and Claire. As I passed the nursery, I noticed the cradle was exactly as it had been earlier, folded up and untouched. My mind raced. Had I really imagined it? Later that night, after Ethan explained Liam's condition and we all settled back down to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At around 3 a.m., I woke up again, this time needing to use the bathroom. The house was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. As I passed the kitchen, I glanced toward the nursery and froze. Claire was standing in the shadows, cradling Liam. She was humming a soft lullaby, her back turned to me. Something about the scene felt off. Her movements were slow, almost mechanical, and the hum didn't quite sound like her usual voice. It was deeper, with an unsettling tone that sent chills down my spine. After a moment of hesitation, I continued to the bathroom. When I came back, I noticed Liam was now lying in the cradle, fast asleep. But when I looked over at the bed in the nursery, Claire was there too, sound asleep beside Ethan. My blood ran cold. Who had I just seen? Shaking, I quietly woke Claire and told her what I'd seen. Her face paled as she scooped Liam out of the cradle and clutched him tightly. We woke Ethan, and I explained everything. Without hesitation, they decided we wouldn't stay in the house for the rest of the night. We packed up some essentials and moved to my mother's house. But the disturbances didn't stop. Even at my mother's house, we began to experience strange occurrences. At night, we'd hear the unmistakable sound of a baby's cradle creaking, though Liam was now sleeping in a bassinet. On several occasions, I caught glimpses of a shadowy figure holding Liam, only for him to be lying safely in his crib moments later. Once, we all heard a voice mimicking Claire's, singing softly in the next room. But when we checked, no one was there. The final straw came when Liam was sent to stay with an aunt in another town. That night, back at my mother's house, we were woken by the sound of a woman wailing outside. Her cries were guttural, filled with anguish, and they seemed to circle the house. We stayed huddled together, too terrified to look outside. The wailing continued until dawn, only ceasing as the first rays of sunlight broke through the windows. After that, my brother sought help from a local priest. He blessed Ethan's house and advised them to abandon the cradle altogether, saying it might have been tied to something malevolent. We later learned that the cradle had belonged to a distant relative, one who had lost her child under tragic circumstances decades ago. It seemed she had never truly let go. Since then, my family has been cautious, avoiding old traditions and ensuring Liam is never left alone. But even now, years later, I sometimes feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up when I hear the faint creak of a cradle in the stillness of the night. In the quiet suburbs of a small Midwestern town, there stood a house steeped in history. It wasn't particularly old, but its walls whispered of generations past. For Emma, the house was home, and for her 6-month-old son, Jack, it was where his young life began. The house, however, carried secrets that would soon unravel in the most terrifying way. Emma had inherited an old wooden cradle from her late grandmother. It was a family heirloom passed down for decades. With its intricate carvings of ivy leaves and a slight creak in its joints, the cradle had always seemed charmingly vintage. "This cradle held your great-grandmother, your grandmother, me, and now Jack," Emma's mother had said with pride when it was brought into the nursery. But Emma always felt a strange chill when she touched it. She dismissed it as nothing more than her overactive imagination. Jack, being a fussy sleeper, seemed to find comfort only in that cradle. When he cried inconsolably, Emma would gently rock him, and he would quickly fall into a deep slumber. Still, the nights when the house fell silent always made Emma uneasy. It began subtly. One night after Emma had rocked Jack to sleep and placed him in the cradle, she heard it creak softly as she left the room. She paused in the hallway, holding her breath. The cradle creaked again, as if being rocked. Slowly, she peeked back into the room. The cradle was still. Jack was sound asleep. Shaking her head, she blamed it on the old wood settling and went to bed. But the sounds grew more frequent. Late at night, Emma would hear the distinct creak of the cradle, steady and rhythmic, as though someone was rocking it. Yet, every time she checked, the nursery was empty, the cradle unmoving. One evening, as Emma put Jack to bed, her husband Mark stayed late at work. The house felt oppressively quiet. After placing Jack in the cradle, she turned on the baby monitor and returned to the living room. From the monitor came the usual soft sounds of Jack's breathing. But then she heard something else, a faint humming. It was a woman's voice, low and melodic, singing a lullaby Emma didn't recognize. Heart pounding, she rushed upstairs. The nursery was empty except for Jack, who lay peacefully in the cradle. The room was colder than the rest of the house, though the heater was on full blast. That was the first night Emma felt true fear. Desperate for answers, Emma called her mother to visit the next day. Over tea, Emma shared her experiences, expecting to be met with a logical explanation. Instead, her mother grew pale. "There's something you need to know about that cradle," she began hesitantly. Emma's great-grandmother, Eleanor, had commissioned the cradle for her firstborn. But tragedy struck when the baby mysteriously died in the cradle at only 3 months old. Over the years, other children in the family who slept in the cradle also suffered from strange illnesses or unexplained accidents. Emma's grandmother had forbidden its use after Emma was born, but it had somehow found its way back into the family. "It's just a story," her mother added quickly, seeing Emma's horrified expression. "I'm sure it's nothing, but if you're uneasy, maybe you should stop using it." That night, Emma decided to move Jack to his bassinet. She placed the cradle in the attic, determined to never use it again. But the cradle wouldn't be ignored. At 2 a.m., Emma was startled awake by the baby monitor. Through the static, she heard the unmistakable sound of the cradle creaking. "No," she whispered, her throat dry. "It's in the attic." She nudged Mark awake, but he dismissed her fears with a groggy wave of his hand. Trembling, Emma crept upstairs to the nursery. The bassinet was empty. Her heart stopped. She turned to the far corner of the room, and there it was, the cradle. It had somehow returned from the attic, and Jack was inside it, sleeping peacefully. Emma couldn't breathe. She reached for her son, her hands trembling as she lifted him out of the cradle. The moment she did, the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and a shadow passed over the wall. It wasn't hers. A soft humming filled the air, the same lullaby she had heard before. "Mark!" she screamed, bolting out of the room with Jack in her arms. Mark came running, but when he checked the nursery, the cradle was gone. "You must have imagined it," he said, though his voice wavered. But Emma knew what she had seen. Over the following days, the activity escalated. The cradle would reappear in the nursery no matter where Emma hid it. She locked it in the garage, threw a blanket over it, and even considered burning it. But each night, it would find its way back. Jack, too, began to change. He no longer cried. Instead, he would stare at the ceiling as if watching something unseen. At times, he would giggle or babble at nothing. One night, Emma woke to find Jack's crib empty again. Her blood ran cold as she heard soft cooing from the living room. When she descended the stairs, the sight froze her in place. The cradle was rocking on its own, and Jack was inside it. Standing over the cradle was a figure, faint, translucent, and unmistakably female. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her face partially obscured, but her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "Give him back," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The figure turned its head slowly, fixing its glowing eyes on her. "He is mine," it hissed in a voice that sounded like wind through dead trees. Emma lunged for Jack, pulling him out of the cradle. The figure let out an ear-piercing scream that shook the house, and for a moment, the room felt as though it were spinning. She ran upstairs and locked herself and Jack in the bedroom, praying for dawn. The next morning, Emma sought help. She contacted a local historian who revealed that Eleanor, her great-grandmother, had been accused of witchcraft. Desperate to protect her firstborn, Eleanor had allegedly performed a dark ritual on the cradle to ward off evil spirits. But the ritual had backfired, binding a malevolent entity to the cradle instead. "This entity sees the children as its own," the historian explained. "You need to destroy it, but it won't be easy. The spirit won't let go willingly." Determined, Emma enlisted the help of the historian and a priest. Together, they devised a plan to destroy the cradle and cleanse the house. That night, as the clock struck midnight, they began the ritual. The priest sprinkled holy water and chanted prayers while Emma and the historian doused the cradle in gasoline. As they lit the match, the house erupted in chaos. Doors slammed, windows shattered, and the wailing of the entity filled the air. The figure materialized before them, its form twisting and contorting with rage. "You cannot take him from me," it screeched, lunging toward Jack, who was cradled in Mark's arms. Emma threw the match and the cradle went up in flames. The entity let out a deafening scream before dissolving into black smoke. The house fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt light. Emma and her family moved out of the house shortly after, leaving behind the haunting memories. The cradle, now reduced to ashes, was buried in consecrated ground. Jack grew up healthy and happy with no memory of the events. But Emma would never forget the cradle's cursed legacy. Even now, years later, when the house is quiet and the wind brushes against the windows, Emma sometimes hears it, the faint creak of a cradle rocking somewhere far away.